So hello everybody, welcome to the July AppEEL webinar. This webinar is having three speakers again. And so two of those are Przemyslaw Żywiczynski and Slawomir Wacewicz, who are members of the Center for Language Evolution Studies, which is a partner institution of AppEEL. And then our other speaker is Peter Gärdenfors. And so Przemek has provided us with an introduction to our first speaker. So Przemek, please go ahead.
Okay, actually, I have forgotten about that bit, so I don't have anything prepared, and I'm afraid it's going to be a short introduction. Of course, with Peter Gärdenfors, any introduction will be too short, and I'm not saying this out of politeness. So Peter is Professor Emeritus at Lund University. He's a cognitive scientist with a keen interest in language origins, and this is the platform where we met. And he's well known for his books, but also for his papers. And one of his favorite topics is pantomimic conceptions of language origins. So I don't know whether, I guess this is as much as I'm capable of doing.
Okay, thanks a lot for that introduction. I will not talk very much about pantomime today. I assume you will do that, and Slawomir will do it as well. But I want to lay kind of groundwork for your talks by talking about the evolution of cognition in general, and as a preparation. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. So yeah. I want to take a very broad start here and ask why human thinking is what we think is unique. Of course, there is a lot of overlap with the thinking of other animals. And this cartoon marks one of the main differences. That is the language. We have the language, we can ask these deep questions, while the thoughts of other animals is more mundane. We think. I mean, of course, we don't know that, but this is the standard view. Almost 20 years ago, I wrote a book with the title of How Homo Became Sapiens, and I will take up some topics for that, but the focus today will be a little bit more on causal cognition. So that's what I will start with, the evolution of causal cognition. But I will also talk about how that makes possible more advanced forms of planning capacities. And then I will talk a little bit about the role of theory of mind and the connection between theory of mind and causal cognition. And I pick out these three aspects of human cognition, because I think this is where we find the largest differences between human cognition and that of other primates or other animals. And I also think that these three topics are necessary to explain things like teaching, which we find more or less uniquely in humans or in hominids, and also to explain why we have forms of cooperation that is more advanced than we find in other species. And finally, of course, these three aspects, causal cognition, planning, and theory of mind, are necessary for the evolution of language. So it's a kind of ground work for that, the evolution of language that my followers here today in the seminar will talk about. So let's start by causal cognition. And Povinelli made some experiments with chimpanzees in particular, where he showed that they were not very good at reasoning about causes. So this is a chimpanzee pushing a stick into this glass tube, and there is a bulb here. So, and this is a peanut. So if you put the stick in this way, then the peanut will fall out here and the chimp can eat it. And if you push the stick this way, the peanut will fall down here. And the chimps had no problems in pushing the stick through the tube. The problem was that even after several attempts, very many attempts, they selected direction at random. These experiments have been repeated. There are some other results. I don't want to get into those, but basically there are some limitations in their ability to reason. In particular, in this case, the consequences of gravitation, not on gravitation on themselves, because that I understand, but the consequences of gravitation on other things, like the peanut in this case. So Tomasello already in 1999 said that I don't view the world in terms of the intermediate hidden forces. And one of the forces he is talking about here are the intentional mental states that are important in human thinking. And I want to build on further on this quote, because I think he's right here. We can think about a lot of hidden forces, while other animals have more problems with that. So that's something I've been working on recently together with Marlies Lombard, who is a South African archaeologist, and she's a specialist of tool use, early tool use in hominids. We have written a series of articles on this topic. So one of our theses is that humans is the only species that can reason about causes that are detached in space and time. But of course, animals can reason about the causes of their own actions and so on. But we can reason about what happens if we throw a thing and see what happens at the end. We can reason about what happens if we prepare a poison and shoot an arrow with a poison arrow towards an animal and so on. So we have these detached causes that we can reason about, while we see very little evidence for that in other animals. We understand the role of forces, and it's not only physical forces like gravitation or hitting with a stone and stuff like that, but it's also what we can call mental forces. I'm convincing you, I'm coercing you to do things. You read my intentions and you use that as a prediction for what I will be doing and so on. And we also think that a reason why we find these kinds of causal thinking in terms of forces in humans and not in other species is that this capacity co-evolved with tool use and the manufacture of tools. I need to see my watch here so I can keep time. Okay, sorry. Now, so just as an example, early examples of hunting gear is tools, hominin tools are stone hammers or thrusting spears. Then you have a direct transmission of the arm force. You have a tool, but the force, you feel the effect of the tool in your arm. But when you shift from a thrusting spear to a throwing spear, then the force stays with somehow the momentum of the spear, and you have to imagine how this momentum affects the animal or enemy that you're throwing the spear at. So then there is this acting of a force at a distance, and the same thing happens when you come a little bit further in the history, when you construct spring traps or shoot with bow and arrow. Then again, there is stored energy. I mean, a spring trap, you store the force and then it's released when an animal comes to the trap. And also in a bow and an arrow, you store the force with your arm and then it's released. And actually, this is kind of strange because you pull your arm in the wrong direction in relation to the direction you want your force to be effective. And then, of course, more advanced is the poisoned arrow. So this is just to give you a few examples of archaeological evidence that can be used to throw light on what kind of causal reasoning is involved in the manufacture and the use of these tools. So that's what I want to say about cause as at the beginning here. But I'll get back to the causal reasoning in connection with other topics here. So the second topic is then planning. And we find lots of planning in animals, but that's what I call immediate planning. So this is planning for present goals. You're hungry now, you're thirsty now, you're tired now, you're cold now, and you want to solve this problem. And you make a plan, and if you're successful, you get rid of this problem. So here is a fairly typical case. A chimpanzee finds a termite nest. either above the ground, or sometimes it's hidden in the ground. And then you can see the chimpanzee walking away from the termites, to break off a twig from a tree, to peel off the leaves from the twig, and then come back and sticking or putting the stick into the termite mound or hill, and then extracting the termites this way. So this involves some kind of mental image on part of the chimpanzee, that it can imagine having a stick and then going away to create this stick. So this is actually a case of tool manufacture that we see in the chimps, in order to solve this problem of getting the termites. So that's an example of planning for present goals. But in hominins and humans, we find what's nowadays called prospective planning, and that means planning for future goals. You may not be hungry now. I mean, you come home from work and you find your refrigerator empty, and you know that you will be hungry tomorrow. I mean, you've been out with your friends, you're full now and happy now, but you realize that you will be hungry tomorrow. So you go out and buy food and put in your fridge because you know that tomorrow you will have the goal of eating, even if you don't have it now. So you have to imagine your future need. In the immediate planning, the need is there. But in prospective planning, you have to imagine your future needs. And that leads to a human dilemma. We must choose between satisfying our current desires. I'm happy now, I'm tired now, I don't want to go shopping. But since I realized that I will be without food tomorrow, I still go out in the dark and the cold and go to the shop and buy food. And we have different personalities. We handle this dilemma in different ways, but we can all live with it to some extent. But the other animal species don't have this dilemma. And this capacity is dependent on our executive control functions in the frontal lobe. We need to block the current goals, the current desires, and somehow let the imagined desires have precedence and determine our actions. So we are dependent on a fairly strongly active frontal lobe, and we know that this is the part of the brain that's grown the most in relation to the brain parts of the chimpanzees. So that's where we have the executive control. There have been some experiments on the great apes to see to what extent they have this capacity for prospective planning. The first was Malkoy and Joseph Kali in 2005, and a former PhD student of mine, Matthias Oswald, did follow-up experiments in 2007, and these are pictures from Matthias's experiments. And the upshot, to make it very brief here, is they keep a tool. In this case, they keep a plastic tube. That in Matthias's case, they are sucking hip syrup from this container here, and they can save that for overnight or for some hours, and because they know that they will be given access to this reward later, and they can solve this dilemma. They can be offered a grape, a choice between the grape and the plastic tube, and the grape is immediate reward, but the plastic tube promises a bigger reward in the future. And actually, most of the experimental chimps prefer the plastic tube here. And they also understand the function of the tool. This is illustrated here. They are given a new rigid plastic tube, and they never seen it before, and I still understand that this can be used to suck up the Hipro syrup from the container. So there are some experiments showing that they have a limited capacity. I mean, overnight is as far as they have been able to do it, as far as I know. But anyway, we're on the verge, or we find the great apes to be on the verge of having some forms of prospective planning. Now we go to archaeology, and these are old tools, the older one tools. They're about 2.5 million years old, and they are rather crude. You need some napping and you need to learn how to do it. But the important point is that it can be shown that the hominins were transporting these tools over rather large distances. When chimpanzees use their tools, if they use the stick to fish for termites, or if they use a hammerstone to crack nuts, they never transport it for very long distances. The stick is created at the moment, and they come back with it to solve a current problem. But archaeologists have been able to establish that these hominins carried these tools with them. And that means they were imagining that they can be using these tools in the future. So already 2.5 million years ago, we have some archaeological evidence for this kind of prospective planning. Yeah. Now that's the second topic, and now I get to the third topic here, and that's theory of mind. And I prefer to use the psychological term here, which is intersubjectivity. I mean, I will probably mix the terms here in my talk. Theory of mind, as philosophers talk about, is mainly concerned with beliefs, but I want to split up this capacity for intersubjectivity in several components. And I did this already in my book from 2003. So the first component is representing the emotions of others, understanding that others are happy or sad or angry. This is what is normally called empathy. And we find that in a number of species. The second capacity is representing the attention of others. And in the animal literature, this is basically studied by looking at gaze following. If somebody is looking intensively at an enemy or some piece of food or something, you can follow their gaze and see what they are looking at. That's what I call representing the attention of others. Then you have representing the desires of others, understanding that somebody else may not like exactly the same thing as you. Somebody else may be thirsty, but you are not thirsty. So you can predict that somebody else, the other individual, will go for water while you don't want to go for water, and so on. The fourth component is understanding the intentions of others. Yeah, we can spend a lot of time talking about understanding intentions, but I don't want to get deeper into it here. And the fifth component is then, this is what is philosophers are mainly interested in, understanding the beliefs of others, understanding that somebody else does not know the same thing about the world as you do. And then we can check where and when we find this capacity. And empathy, we find in all mammals that have been tested. Birds show empathy, and maybe other animals. So this is widely spread in the animal kingdom, and it develops very early in infants. I don't know. I mean, there is no exact limit here, but very early, if an infant laughs, then the other infant will laugh. If one infant cries, the others will cry, and so on. This empathy develops quite early. Following gaze is found in primates and in dogs and goats and in some other animals. And some birds, I think, the corvids in particular, and it develops gradually in children. When they are 6 months, they can follow the head direction of their mother. When they are 12 months, they can follow the eye direction of the mother. So even if she just turns her eyes, the children can follow the eyes. And when they are 1.5 years, they can follow the mother's gaze, even if she's looking at something that is outside view of the infant. They turn their head to see what the mother is looking at. The third component, representing the desires of others, has not been studied very carefully in other animals. I could give you some examples of primates, but I don't want to spend time on that. In children, somewhere between around a year and a half, they can understand that somebody doesn't like the same food as you do. There are some experiments concerning that. Intentions are also fairly badly studied. There are some experiments with chimps where you either try to trick the chimp or you give them a reward, and the chimp understand the difference between your behavior and when you're tricking them or when you're helping them. And the same thing applies to children around 1 year of age. And then finally, representing the beliefs of others. There is some recent experiment by the Leipzig group that gives some indication that chimps understand that a human that doesn't have the same or has a false belief. In general, this capacity is tested by judging whether they can understand that somebody has a false belief. And in children, this is a contended area, but somewhere between 3 and 4 years old, it's developed in human children. There are certain aspects of it that comes earlier. But again, I don't want to get into the details. The important thing here is that theory of mind is not a unitary thing. It consists of very complicated factors, and my 5 factors may probably be divided into some further ones. So we can talk about joint attention, for instance, and we can talk about joint beliefs, which is more complicated than just attention and beliefs. And as you see from this list, that as we go down here, we go down in the number of species that have these capacities. So down here, it's basically only humans, and with a question mark for chimps. And up here, it's all mammals. And we see that basically we go up in ages in human children when they manage this capacity. So I think that when we're looking for evolution of language and evolution of other cognitive capacities, we need to keep these different functions of theory of mind in our minds, because it's a very complicated phenomenon. Theory of mind is not a unitary phenomenon. So now Marlies Lombard and I, we have written about the connection between causal cognition and theory of mind. So we think that theory of mind is part of causal cognition. That is, we use understanding the intentions of others, understanding the desires of others in reasoning about or predicting the behavior of others. So having a theory of mind is an important component in causal reasoning about other individuals in our vicinities or in our group. And we need more and more advanced forms of theory of mind. So the false beliefs task is actually a task about predicting where a person will go who has a false belief. So that's using the theory of mind to make a causal prediction. So a very general thesis is that the evolution of causal cognition depends more and more on representations of hidden variables. And the hidden variables are partially physical, like the gravitation. You don't see gravitation, you see the effects of gravitation. There are other hidden forces like water streams and things like that. There are very hidden physical variables like poison and so on. And then we have the theory of mind variables, the emotions, the beliefs, the desires, the intentions, and so on, are also hidden variables. So we see that causal cognition is connected to understanding more and more hidden variables, both physical and mental hidden variables. Yeah, that's a summary of the connection here. So I want to say a few words about the evolution of teaching, because I have recently started working on the connection between teaching and the evolution of language. So for me, this is teaching may be a precursor to evolution of language. And here, theory of mind comes in. We don't see we haven't seen any clear examples of intentional teaching in other animal species. They teach by facilitating or scaffolding their infants. They teach by signaling that something by approval or disapproval. That's forms of teaching. But as far as we understand, these are not intentional forms. And in order to be teach intentionally, you have to understand that the student doesn't know. And that is, of course, it depends on the theory of mind. You have to know that the other individual does not know. So without a developed theory of mind, you can't engage in intentional teaching. So that's a second order theory of mind. I mean, some of you may know about Dennett's hierarchy of first, second, and third order theory of mind. And this is, I know that you don't know. So that's a second order theory of mind. And in an article I wrote together with another archaeologist, the Swedish archaeologist Anders Högberg, we argue that even these simple Oldowan tools, they require intentional teaching. You can't learn them by simple copying. I mean, a chimpanzee who is cracking nuts learns to crack nuts by watching the older chimpanzee, by imitating their behavior. And it's difficult to learn, but we never see the chimpanzees teaching their infants how to crack nuts. But Anders and I, we claim that even the simple Oldowan tools are so complicated and needs a bit of planning in order to be created, that they require intentional teaching in form of demonstrate. You show how to do, or pantomime. You don't make the nap off the flake. You just pantomime how to do a thing there. So we think that demonstration and pantomime were in place already at least 2.5 million years ago. And you should note that you can show things, show how to do things, and you can pantomime without any spoken language, without any sign language. So for us, this is a kind of precursor to intentional communication, and that is used in teaching. And my fellow speakers here will continue on this theme, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. Finally, I want to say a few words about what distinguishes human communication from animal communication. And for me, the main distinction is what I call that we communicate about detached things. Some of you may know about Hockett's notion of displacements, and this is basically the same. It's communicating about what is not present. And you can do that by sign, by gesture, by pantomime. You don't need spoken language for it, but of course, spoken language improves it. And that's necessary to be able to cooperate about future goals. I haven't had the time to talk about cooperation here, but what distinguishes human cooperation from animal cooperation is that we are much better at cooperating about future goals. And if we want to plan our cooperation, then we need some kind of communication about what is not present. So that's the connection with cooperation. So finally, why only humans evolved symbolic communication? Symbolic doesn't mean words, it means just signs or that are detached, can be combined. So we lived in an ecological niche that benefited from planning for future needs. We lived in an open landscape, and we needed to coordinate our actions before we did things. And it benefited from our theory of mind, our intersubjectivity, so we could share our inner world. And so planning for future needs made cooperation about future goals, the beneficial for the hominins. I said that recently. And in order to cooperate about the future, we need some form of symbolic communication. So the reason is that we have language. The very brief answer to that is that we, in our ecology, made it beneficial for us to cooperate about future goals. So this is summarizing 6 million years since we separated from the chimpanzees in 30 minutes. So I've been forced to be very superficial here, but I hope you've gotten some kind of idea of how I think about causal cognition, planning, and theory of mind. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And I guess I'm still doing the honors. So
yes, please. Thank you very much, Peter.
I guess we have like 10 minutes for discussion now before we go into.
Yeah, so we have 10 minutes. So I suggest that we just do it together. So if people have a question, they can just raise their virtual hand, and then we can see that, and then we take it from there.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I don't have. I can't find my virtual hand.
I can't find my hand either. Sorry.
Well, so okay, just ask then. Okay, there.
You can use real hands as well. That's fine.
Okay, Chetty, you have a question.
Peter, I just wondered, in the theory of mind for the great apes, orangutans, etc., there is a famous YouTube video which only goes for 40 seconds. So I will just try and put that in the chat. You don't have to watch it now, but it's an orangutan somebody does a magic trick at the zoo with a cup and hiding an object in it. And the orangutan, I think it's an orangutan, appears to react with amusement. It seems to be surprised initially and then shocked and sort of smiles and falls back laughing in inverted commas. I know in Darwin's expression of the emotions, animals and man, I don't think he discussed amusement very much, but in your understanding, do primates have this sense that someone's tricking me and it can be funny? The sense of amusement?
Yeah. What I'm questioning is whether this is a theory of mind. I mean, you're perfectly right that animal laughter exists, but it normally exists in play situations or in tickling situations. Animals, rats and monkeys, apes laugh when you tickle them, and they laugh when they play. And there is Panksepp and others have shown that there are good evidence that this is really laughter. But what you're giving is a more advanced case of amusement, of being something unexpected happens, and in definitions of human humor, you have this idea that it's something social, it's unexpected, but it's not dangerous. And that's what makes things funny. And I think all these three criteria are satisfied by the orangutan you're talking about. I haven't seen this video, but I've seen other videos of animals watching a magic trick, and they all look surprised. I mean, they show surprise, but they're not afraid, because there is no threat into it. So that's interesting that you find traces. I mean, if your description is correct, which I take it for granted, that even the orangutan can show some form of amusement in this kind of situation.
So yeah, I'm interested in why some humans do and don't seem to have more and less advanced sense of humor, and wondering if generally primates share the same, where that emerged. Or one other quick one was, I think in Descent of Man, there's a story Darwin tells about a hunting dog who's collecting 2 ducks, and one of the ducks is still alive and looks like it's going to get away. So the hunting dog ran over and actually snaps the duck's neck and immobilizes it, then goes and fetches the other one and then brings the other one back. That's quite a complex theory of future planning and resource management, do you think? Or
no, I wouldn't say so, because both ducks are present and the dog knows about the presence. I wouldn't say that's future planning, because they are in the situation, and even if it's a very smart behavior. I mean, going to the duck that is only hurt and not dead. That's a smart. The dog is smart, but I wouldn't think that's future planning. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
There's a question from Michael. There's a question from Michael Player, please.
Hi, thanks. Great talk. I was thinking, I recently read Amanda Seed's and Kevin Lalin's new paper in the Annual Review of Psychology on Human Cognitive Uniqueness, where they say that the thing with causal planning and with tool use is that these are things that essentially only emerge once children are already competent language users. So that, especially if you look at tool use, it's that children are not very good at it until they're like 8 or 9 years old. Before that, kind of other species are kind of similar. So I was thinking about what your view on kind of this relationship is. Is causal planning, you talk a bit about interactions, but it's like causal planning something that's dependent on other factors, developmentally and possibly evolutionarily.
Mm-hmm. I'm not aware of this article and this kind of research saying that tool use comes that late. I mean, we see cases of tool use in very young children, and they understand. I mean, there are good cases of demonstration and pantomime when a parent brings a new tool, new toy that you have to show how it functions. You demonstrate for the kid, a small infant, how it works, how this toy works, and the kid picks it up quite easily. So I don't think, I mean, this is my immediate reply here. You don't need language to be able to use tools, but of course, pantomime demonstration will help you and understand how tools work. And that's why it's so interesting to see that chimps don't use demonstration in nut cracking. The infants would learn much quicker if the parents showed how to hold the hammer stone and how to put the nut and so on. There are only anecdotal evidence for this kind of teaching in chimps, but no real data there. So there is definitely a difference, but I would put it much more on tool use, much more related to demonstration than dependent on language.
Okay,
there's also a question of Michael Brady. Michael, please. You are muted, Michael.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Talking about future planning, the very beginning, would you count things like squirrels hiding nuts to be used later, or birds who cache food? And apparently some of them at least make fainting moves so that they apparently hide some food someplace, but they really don't, to trick their co-species friends from finding their food? Is that examples of future planning on your view?
For squirrels, no. For scrub jays, maybe. For squirrels, there is no evidence that they have any imagination of the coming winter and so on. And you can trick the squirrels in several ways, and they will not adapt their behavior to what you do to them. But you mentioned this study of scrub jays, where if somebody is watching a scrub jay, another scrub jay is watching one scrub jay hiding seeds, then the first scrub jay, the hider, will move, replace the seeds when the onlooker is gone, because that's a theory of mind, the theory of attention. The scrub jay who's hiding a seed understands that the other scrub jay sees where it's been hidden, and it understands that it will disappear very quickly unless it moves it to another place. So the scrub jays have a theory of mind. And there are some cases, Nick Clayton's group in Cambridge have shown that they also have some forms of planning for the future. So they are in their case, I would say, yeah, probably they have planning for the future, but for the squirrels, definitely no.
Thank you very much, Peter. And so with this, we have to end your session. But I want to say that after all talks, there is the possibility to ask more questions to Peter and to all the other speakers. So just write down your question so you are sure to remember it. And then after all the talks, we have informal breakout rooms. Okay, thank you very much, Peter, for your very interesting talk. So now we are moving on to Przemyslaw Żywiczynski, and Przemek is professor of linguistics at the Department of English at the Nicolaus Copernicus University, which is in Turin in Poland. He is co-founder and head of the Center for Language Evolution Studies, which is a key research team at his university. And there it is also part of IMCERT, which is Interacting Minds, Societies and Environments, which is a group that is part of the University's Center of Excellence. Beyond that, he is also the vice president of the Polish Society of Human and Evolutionary Studies, and he is, of course, also the co-founder of the Ways to Proto-Language conference series. So, Przemek, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. That's a proper introduction. Actually, I'm not head of Center for Language Evolution Studies. Sławek is. But anyway, so I try sharing my screen. There's a huge thunderstorm over the city. So there may be problems with connectivity that I won't be able to control. But let's hope it won't happen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So perhaps minimize that. Yeah. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor, particularly a great honor to speak after Peter, who has been a very inspirational figure for my research. And today I will talk about proto-language, and specifically I will talk about pantomimic theories of proto-language, focusing on the problem of conventionality and iconicity. So this is my presentation, but this is kind of a result of the ongoing collaboration with Roma-3, the Cosmic Lab, and Lund University, the Cognitive Semiotic Unit. And in our pantomime studies, we are doing a number of empirical studies on pantomime, but here I will focus on a more theoretically oriented research, and specifically I will focus on two papers, one authored by Sławek and myself with Jordan Zlatev, and the other, the same duo with Casey Lister. Well, first things first, proto-language. So proto-language is an old idea, and it featured prominently in many traditional accounts of language emergence. But it is also one of the key terms or the key concepts in modern science of language evolution. A very generic definition, it's a hypothetical communication system that is simpler than language, but nevertheless possesses some characteristics of language. And we see proto-language understood in this way in the foundational works of this line of research, Hughes's papers, Derek Bickerton's Language and Species, Jack and Dobb's Foundations of Language, and it still continues to organize the discussion or investigation into language origins. So proto-language is positioned on the evolutionary continuum between systems of cognition and communication attributed to last common ancestor with chimps on the one hand, and on the other with fully fledged language. And as for the beginning, it's usually those systems of communication are approximated as communicative behaviors of extant non-human apes. So what are pantomimic conceptions of proto-language? Well, these are these proposals that understand proto-language as pantomime. That is the development of proto-language, the development of full language went through the phase when our ancestors communicated mainly by pantomime. And these proposals have been put forward by many forefront figures of language evolution, such as Michael Arbib, Michael Tomasello, people affiliated with mimesis theory, largely speaking. You've heard one of them. There's also Jordan Zlatev. Some important people in language origins nowadays occasionally mention pantomime, and such is the case of Michael Kobalis. And in traditional accounts of language emergence, particularly those that were elaborated during the Enlightenment, we could classify them as hypotheses of pantomimic proto-language. So this is the pictorial representation. You've seen Peter, so I've decided to show Jordan Zlatev as a young man, in fact. Okay, so then we would say that on these accounts, pantomime constituted the original human-specific communication system that was qualitatively different from what we find in today's apes and what is attributed to last common ancestor, and something that is also qualitatively different from full language. The problem with many pantomimic approaches, many pantomimic proposals, is that they are not very generous when it comes to defining a pantomime, perhaps apart from Peter's work. So in one of our papers, we enumerated the criteria for pantomime as calibrated to language origins. So what are the constraints when we take language, the perspective of language origins, when we talk about pantomime? And I will just brush through them. There's quite a few of them. But in terms of importance, they can be summarized into the following. So pantomime relies, semiotically, it relies on signs that are iconic and not conventional. That is, the relation between the form and meaning is based on similarity. They are primarily visual, that is, it is body movements that are primarily responsible for the transmission of referential meaning. Pantomime is holistic in the sense that it is not easily decomposable into units. It's communicatively complex and self-sufficient. That is, pantomime can communicate meanings without resource to other semiotic systems, particularly semiotic conventions, and it is semantically advanced. An important point here raised by Peter was that it should be able to communicate displaced meanings, that is, to convey information beyond the here and now. And in this talk, I will focus on iconicity and conventionality, or non-conventionality. And I think that a lot of the other requirements are actually consequences of the type of iconicity that pantomime involves. So this will be my focus here, but I will also try to talk about other things. Okay, but the relation between iconicity and conventionality is a complex one. So in very general terms, we could say that when iconicity decreases, then conventionality decreases. But if we study particular examples of iconic signs, then we see how much conventionality they actually involve. And to give the well-known example of onomatopoeias, that is lexemes in which are based on sound symbolism. So you have the words for a particular species of bird, English, Polish, and Danish, and they all, okay, this always happens, they all capture this sound quality that is emitted by the bird. But of course, in doing so, these words are different. So in doing so, they follow phonematic principles of particular languages. So you can see a very strong normalized element of conventionality. Okay, so when we put it on the level of semiotic considerations and consult many models of the sign, for example, Persian model, and if we look at representamen and object, we will see that it's very difficult to find pure icons. That is, signs in which similarity between the form and meaning is the only thing that matters. So, consulting an influential line of interpreting Persian semiotics proposed by Roman Jakobson would say that in every sign there are three grounds: the iconic ground, the indexical ground, and the conventional ground. And but it's usually one ground that dominates. So if we go back to our definition of pantomime, OCS is original communication system. So I use it as an abbreviation. We should say that these are acts of bodily visual communication which are dominated by the iconic ground with minimal input of conventional ground. Then the next question we could ask is how much, because iconicity is also scalar, how much iconicity is required for pantomime? And we're still talking, of course, we are still talking about pantomime in language origins. But to illustrate it, if you're not familiar with the Chinese characters, so probably you wouldn't know what it means. But if I tell you that this actually means river, then you will be able to see similarity between the sign and meaning post factum. But when you see a photo of a river, or even a somewhat stylized drawing of a river, then you should be able to know its meaning, what it refers to an actual river. So this brings us to the distinction between two types of iconicity, or two two endpoints on the scale of iconicity. One would be primary iconicity, when the form itself is enough to understand the meaning, like in the case of photos and drawings. And the other, secondary iconicity, when you are able to perceive the similarity only if you know the meaning. And so again, when we go back to our definition, we should say that pantomime requires primary iconicity. And this goes for example, this is important when we refer back to the criterion of self-sufficiency, that pantomime should be understood on its own, so to speak. Okay, so you should be able to understand this, or to understand that this actually refers to, well, the praxic action was multimodal, so we didn't run a test, but I hope you got it. That the pantomime actually referred to the action of hammering. So now, in my talk, I would like to use terms and concepts mainly from gesture studies to look at pantomime. That is to try to characterize pantomime using different concepts mainly from gesture literature, where pantomime thematically belongs to. So one thing that we could say, and this is the requirement of primary iconicity, is that pantomime involves body-to-body enactment. So its relevance part of the body represent the movements of the character or action that we are representing. Then, related to that, we can try to specify what type of enactments pantomime involves. One more thing, a lot of activities, everyday activities, involves the coordinated activity of the whole body. That's why pantomimes tend to be whole body rather than just manual as co-speech gestures. Another thing is, when we want to look at the type of enactment, this brings us to the concept of viewpoint proposed by McNeill, and distinction into character viewpoint and object viewpoint. So the first would be like the pantomime scene actually is incorporated in the gesture space. And this would be the example of our pantomime, whereas object viewpoint, you pantomime or you gesture about something as if it is a scene outside. So we could compare our pantomime with the object viewpoint gesture of hammering, when the dominant hand performs the hammering movement. It also possibly represents the hammer, and the non-dominant hand is what is being hammered. Going further, so we would say that this is body-to-body enactment that mainly involves character viewpoint. Then we could also consider the problem of space, and here I refer to Brown and colleagues' work, and they follow the distinction into peripersonal space, that is the space, the bubble that surrounds our body. So these are the things that are about our body, that has to do directly with our body. An extra personal space, which is the outside world with objects in it. And then kind of combine it with another distinction in enactment now. And they distinguish egocentric enactment, that is enactment that is done with respect to the actor, and allocentric, which is about objects outside in the world. And based on these two distinctions, they propose different communicative strategies for gesture of pantomime, 3 for peripersonal space, 2 for extrapersonal space, Two of them involve body part use when there is a direct mapping of body parts onto body parts. One or two of them with body part replacement. So let's look at examples. So one of them is intransitive body action when you, for example, pantomime walking. There is imaginary object when you, for example, pantomime driving a car by holding an imaginary steering wheel. Body part replacement for peripersonal space would be doing this, that is performing the movement that pantomimes the scissors when you actually, when your hand or your two fingers represent scissors. And body part replacement for extra personal space would be moving your fingers to represent rain drops. So again, when we refer to what we've said about pantomime, the requirements of pantomime, we would say that it relates to peripersonal space with this direct mapping of body to body. It involves egocentric enactment and specifically intransitive action, imaginary object, and kind of on the verge body part as object. This was the scissor example. Okay, if we go further, there is also classification proposed by Cornelia Müller of modes of representation. So this is independent of the other concepts, particularly viewpoint. And this classification focuses on how gesture represents particular properties of objects and actions. So we have acting, when we actually act out activities such as grasping, pulling, hitting. We have molding, when you use your body to show or to represent an object in kind of 3 dimensions. Drawing, which is the same, but it uses kind of 2-dimensional space. And representing, when you use your body part to represent an object. So here, actually, you will have a combination. In this example, you will have a combination of acting with kind of miming the movements that you make when you write, and representing with your non-dominant hand, representing what you write on. So again, when we go back to our definition, pantomime would involve mainly acting, and perhaps to an extent representing when combined with acting, just like in this example. There is also an interesting case of personification, when body-to-body mapping does not concern the human body, but is mapped on other things, like, for example, the animal. This is very easy with kind of vertebra body plan. So here, the hands are mapped onto wings, and this could be interpreted as body-to-body enactment, but we can also do such personifications when we pantomime about objects. So again, to add up to our definition, then pantomime, when we talk about modes of representation, would involve acting, representing, and perhaps cases of personification. So the last thing in this definitional pursuit that I'd like to discuss is realism. So this is also a concept from gesture studies, that is realism in terms of time, duration, form, and direction of communicative movement. So how close pantomime is to what it represents in these regards. So how realistic something must be to be pantomime. So again, these 2 examples. So you can see, or hopefully come to the conclusion, that pantomime at least in such cases, is quite realistic, but it is different from what it represents. That is, the pantomime of hammering is actually different from the praxic action of hammering. So I'd like to focus here on the concept proposed by Peter, that is pretense. So in pantomime, we don't perform an action, but we kind of pretend to be doing this action. So if we put it in semiotic terms, and again, here we have the Persian triangle, so representamen, or the form, must be distinguishable from object. And so pantomime must perform sign function. So pantomime refers, like if we take hammering pantomime, so hammering pantomime refers to the praxic action of pantomime, but not the other way around. The praxic action of pantomime does not signify the pantomime of hammering. Okay, so here we go back to our definition. So we have realism, and pantomime must be realistic, but must involve pretense and sign function. Okay, so what is such pantomime good for? A lot of pantomimic conceptions highlight that the primary function of pantomime was actually to its primary function was for narration. So is it possible to narrate using pantomime as we defined it? Well, here is a short clip, and this is from the research done by Francesco and his colleagues. So if you could bear with that for a moment. Okay, so I hope this was a convincing demonstration that you can narrate at least a simple story using pantomime, this ice cream situation. But there are limitations to this form of communication, this pantomime as we defined it. So what are those? One of them concerns realism. So this is our famous example. And however, when we have to pantomime different but similar actions, such as, for example, hammering and chiseling, we will have to highlight, or the actor will have to highlight the most important and distinguishing characteristics and downplay all the other characteristics. So here we have one such case. So that would be chiseling. So under such circumstances, pantomime becomes much more schematic, and as a consequence, it becomes realistic. So when we have the situation of crowding the semantic space, when the number of meanings, particularly similar meanings, increases, then pantomime becomes less realistic. When we pantomime, for example, transitive events, so something that you will see here. So again, she adopts, this is of course the action of somebody pushing somebody else. And you can see how the actor takes perspectives. In the beginning, the perspective of the agent, at the end, the perspective of the patient, which distorts again the realism of pantomime. So it's taking multiple perspectives, but things can get even more complex. So here you have pantomiming the action of strangling, and this in one movement, this pantomime actually incorporates both agents, both agent and patient. To give a very extreme example of that, and this is taken from our research. So this is a very crowded semantic space. There are 4 actions: kissing, pushing, slapping, waving. 4 types of participants that have different age and different gender. And these are transitive actions. And when actors are faced with such tasks to make pantomimes distinguishable, like making number 2, for example, in the matrix, distinguishable from all other events in the matrix, pantomimes tend to look like that. Okay, so I don't know whether it was easy to guess. We'll play it once again, but yeah, actually this was the pantomime, and we can, I guess it would be nice to see it once more. So you can see that he uses indexical strategy for marking size and gender. When gender, he uses kind of a conventional gesture for that. He uses the molding gesture. Then there is the pantomimic element. Then there is the indexical strategy to show the age of the patient, and the conventional kind of conventionalized gesture to show the gender. And this was done in non-interactive setting. So this is how actors would deal with such situations. So to take stock in real communicative situations, or even in experimental communicative situations, when there is some crowding of semantic space, the primary iconicity characteristic of pantomime decreases. There is an increase in indexicality and in conventionality. So pantomimes become less realistic. There are multiple perspectives that actors employ in one pantomime. Hence, pantomimes become less holistic and more compositional. There is strategies such as taking object viewpoint, using extra-personal space, and different modes of representation. But still, we would insist that this is all based on this basic potential of pantomime, which is iconic and mimetic. There is a number of outstanding questions, some of them that we are trying to answer, like what is the scale of conventionality in enactments? So we are currently publishing a paper on cross-cultural differences in understanding pantomimes. What is the pressure for the simplification of these enactments? The role of other non-gestural modalities in enactments, and perhaps theoretically most important, what are the preconditions, cognitive and socio-cognitive preconditions for pantomime, which will take us actually to the other talk. That is, we believe that the emergence of pantomime must have been preceded by the emergence of cooperation, or what we call platform of trust. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Przemyslaw. Questions? We have about 5 minutes for questions. Let me switch to the gallery view. Just raise, okay, Peter. Peter, you have a question, please.
I have one question and one advertisement. And the question is, you emphasize that pantomime is full body. And that's part of your definition. But I can go do a full body imitation of a frog. I won't do it. But I could also do a thing like this, jumping with my hand, and that would be another pantomime for a frog. I could do a full body walking, but I could also do things like this with my fingers, and that would be a pantomime, in my opinion. But I mean, is that your, would you call that a more iconic or a less iconic form of pantomime? You wouldn't call it a pantomime anymore, but that's on the way to this more conventional stuff. That's my question. My advertisement is that you said that pantomime is for narrating, but I've argued that the primary function of pantomime is for teaching, and I've just published a paper where I show that there are several features in pantomime for teaching, but that shows that it's primary, I mean cognitively and evolutionary primary to pantomime for narrating, but you don't have to comment on that.
Well, actually, I would like to comment on that, and I think I know the paper. So actually, we focus on certain structural characteristics of pantomime, but we believe, or I believe, that actually pantomime or demonstration was primary to pantomime for communication. But I didn't focus on that. So. And again, in relation to the first question, what I tried to do is to characterize prototypical pantomime. So if we take the requirement of primary iconicity, then you have certain characteristics that follow. Pantomime doesn't have to be full body. One thing, even in primary iconic pantomimes, there are certain actions that do not involve the whole body. Yes. Like, for example, writing. So this is one limitation. And but if we take the criterion of primary iconicity, then yes, the pantomime should involve enactment rather than what you have just done, representing. And if we look at empirical evidence, for example, from emerging sign languages, this seems to hold ground, that first we have enactments, very often full body enactments, only later movements become more limited and people start using different modes of representation. So I would still say, I would say that this is prototypical pantomime. It has some empirical grounding, but pantomime will very quickly evolve into different modes of representation. And when we have recordings of one actor, they actually discover it like through going through 20 rounds. So it's more like an ideal point, a theoretical point where pantomime begins, but probably it doesn't happen in real life circumstances, so to speak. Thanks. Thank you.
Can I just have a very quick rejoinder?
Yes.
The definition is definition of pantomime as a communicative system rather than individual like gestures of pantomime. So my analogy would be like you can have words in some languages without vowels, but you can't have a language without vowels, right? So whole bodiness would be an important criterion of pantomime as a system rather than a necessary condition of all gestures.
Yes, I have to agree with that. Because we
Yes, sorry.
No,
No, please.
because we wrote those papers together. Yes.
There's also a question from Anton, and it's the last one that we have time for. Anton. You're muted. Okay, now I hear you.
So, I don't know, have you tried it with your students? You gave us example with a man with guitar and his story. Have you tried to give the story to random students and ask them to describe what do they see in this story? You would be surprised how different stories they will give you, especially if you ask students from different faculties. For example, programmers, mechanical department or biology departments, they will tell you a different story. And we have a French, in my university in Russia, we have a French assistant who didn't speak Russian language, and he gave classes in French language. And students had very basic level of French language, and he mostly used pantomimic language to explain what he wants from them. And sometimes they combine English a little bit. And it's funny, we did experiments with this French assistant. We gave students movies. Maybe you know Louis de Funès. He's very famous actor who has many gestures. He uses body language. And we did experiments with his movies without sound. And we noticed that many students have different stories. So they extract different stories. So what do you think about this polysemanticity of this language? Maybe we need intersubjectivity to have a common understanding, because in his classes, they created kind of microculture, and they had a hint language and intersubjectivity. And those students who missed classes, they couldn't understand his hints and his body language. So only those who attended classes. So kind of conventional body language. They created conventional body language. Okay.
Yes, thank you for this question. And well, pantomime requires a context. Like, even if we look at hammering, which is a simple example, there may be different ways people hammer in different places. They use different hammers, and they use different nails, and they use hammering for different purposes. So you need this, yes. And this is the question: how much conventionality is there in pantomime? We had a guessability study with Polish and Italian pantomimes in collaboration with the Cosmic Lab, and we found that, contrary to our expectations, we thought that people who share the culture will guess those pantomimes better. There is Italian will guess Italian actors better, Polish participants will guess Polish pantomimes better. But it turned out that it was not the case, that actually Italians were better both for Poles and for Italians. So there are also strange things going on. But perhaps I will end on a general mode, on a general note. Pantomime is great, for example, for displaced communication, but it's also very costly. It's cognitively costly, particularly. It requires creative inference, yes? That's why this illustrates a limitation of pantomime. And in our view, and in view of other people, this was one of the factors that actually pushed pantomime towards conventional, more conventional proto-language, and later full language. Yeah, so it's a huge topic, but this is what I would say now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Przemyslaw, for this very interesting talk. We have to move on to the next speaker, but thank you very much. Our next speaker is Slawomir Wacewicz, who is also at that same Center for Language Evolution Studies, where he now is the full director of the center. So many congratulations with that promotion. And so he's also a professor in linguistics at the Department of English at the Nicolaus Copernicus University in Torun in Poland. And he is also the head of EVO, which is the Evolution of Communication Systems Research Group, which is also part of IMSERT, the Interacting Minds, Societies and Environments. So Slawomir, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Natalie, for inviting me. And I would like to thank both Peter and Przemek for the talks and references to what is now coming from me. So I'm joining you from Prague, and where I'm visiting Charles Uni, and my Eduroam connection has been stable for the entire time until the introduction, where I got a message about connection being unstable. So please let me know if you lose the connection. I have backup options, but I hope that it will be fine. So let me share my screen. And okay, so I hope you can see.
We can see.
All right, great. So I'm going to talk about two types of pantomime, and I'm going to argue in brief that there is not one pantomime, but actually there are two, and there are like different tools, like a hammer and like a screwdriver, that have been built for specific different purposes, and what they look like is explained by the purposes for which they were built. That's the argument in short. So this is partly joint research with Przemek, and part of that presentation is known to at least one person in the audience, because I had an opportunity to present it before, like a significant part of this presentation in Jiangxia two years ago, but there are new elements as well. Okay, good. So let me start by, okay. All right, so let me start with introduction on evolutionary explanations. When it comes to evolutionary explanations, first move the bar. Okay, good. Evolutionary explanations or accounts of language very, very often turn out to be disappointingly non-evolutionary, and this is captured, for example, in this quote from Peter's recent paper. Now, for example, it must be shown that language was useful and adapted specifically for proto-humans, not for proto-chimpanzees. Many theories fail on that count. So far, so good, but I would say we can do even better than that. So a typical evolutionary explanation is given in terms of cognitive stages. And evolutionary is usually taken to mean like gradually increasing complexity. So we go from simple to complex and without leaps. And I don't want to say that this is wrong. I actually think that this is right as a default. But I do want to say that this is incomplete. And why this is incomplete is because we often tend to have like anthropocentric assumptions in thinking about language and language origins. And again, it's not something that people say, but my suspicion is that this is what many people kind of think or believe deeply. Three things: that other apes do not use language because they are too stupid. If they weren't, then they could have language. And if they had language, then they would use language because it's so great. Okay? And the thing is that I'm not convinced about any of those 3 points, because apes are cognitively very sophisticated, and in Peter's talk, we had some of that sophistication, also limitations. But when you look at the recent data, some of which was mentioned, apes have some displacement at least. They have at least some theory of mind. They have social calculus and you name it. Maybe it's not enough for language cognitively, but apes can point at the very least. So we can make a Thomasellian point that if apes wanted to be more informative than they are now in their daily lives, nothing prevents them basically from going around and pointing for each other to inform each other of things, right, that are of interest, but they don't do this. And I would say they won't do this. Perhaps that's a better expression. And language is great for humans, right? Because being human is using language in an important way. And if I think on how adaptive language would be to an individual chimpanzee, if a chimpanzee had language in a chimpanzee society, I'm not convinced that it would be very adaptive, right? Even if two chimpanzees had language, not necessarily, that would not necessarily be adaptive. Okay, and the upshot would be this, a quote that I like, that it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. And I would like to suggest that maybe we are approaching language evolution from a wrong direction, or at least, at the very least, the direction that we are approaching language evolution and cognitive evolution is incomplete, right? So I would say it is difficult to get the chimpanzee to understand something when the chimpanzee's payoff depends on not understanding it, or at least doesn't depend on understanding it. And pantomimic theories in this respect, pantomimic theories of language origins are usually framed in terms of cognitive requirements for production, and especially for understanding pantomime and what apes are missing, right? So there are some components that apes do not have, and because of that, they do not do pantomime, they cannot understand, well, iconic communication, for example. I would like to suggest that first, that okay, so far so good, this is fine, but perhaps we need to look more at the paycheck. Right? What the gains are, what the costs and benefits are in terms of fitness, right? Because when we take a look at the textbooks and books in animal signals and the evolution of animal communication, we do not find talk about cognition. Well, there is some information on cognition and language, but for the most part, the typical explanations are couched in terms of payoffs and fitness, right? Okay, and from that perspective, the key variable that predicts a lot of things that follow is alignment of interest between individuals, and we can extend that to incorporate inclusive fitness, for example. But alignment of interest between individuals, or the genetic interest between individuals. So you can either have alignment of interest, that is no conflict of interest, or you can have disalignment of interest. And disalignment of interest is, all right, disalignment of interest is partial conflict of interest. So the conflict of interest need not be like complete. It can be partial, because like complete conflict of interest predicts no interaction, basically. So when there is alignment, and I've color-coded it for the ease of processing. So blue is cooperative, everything is fine, no conflict of interest, cooperation, this type of thing. We have cooperation, and in communication, this means following the classic argument of Krebs and Dawkins. This means conspiratorial whispers and signals that become cheap, become subtle. They are efficient, without wasting energy. And because of that, they become inconspicuous, because conspicuousness carries other costs than just energetic expenditure. Conversely, when we have a disalignment of interest, this predicts manipulation. This predicts expensive hype, at least in prototypical situations. And this predicts signals that are costly, that are ritualized, loud, repetitive, conspicuous, and exaggerated. Because when we are in a disalignment of interest, this predicts self-benefiting behavior. And in terms of communication, this translates into displays that would be a prototypical, like self-benefiting signal that are designed to convince. However, when we have alignment of interest, we can enjoy other benefiting behaviors because our interests are the same, right? So if I'm benefiting you, I'm benefiting myself if there is no conflict of interest. And this allows for the evolution of information donation. So I'm giving you honest information as something that you will benefit from, but I will benefit with you. And this predicts signals that are designed to inform rather than convince. So, okay, I'll give examples later. Yes, and actually prototypical examples that are also color-coded, this would be a prototypical display that would be fireworks, right? Fireworks work as a proof of, like if you do fireworks, that proves that you can afford them, basically. And prototypical prototypical information donation would be like maybe a newspaper. Maybe that's a bad example now, something like a report. Okay, and what are the features of of those two different types of signaling? In the first case, we have low information value, usually analog scale, so and evidence. So, for example, if we take a roar of a deer, right? It can only convey information about, well, maybe not one dimension, but a couple of dimensions. And the louder the, not the louder, but the quality of the roar is linearly correlated with, or almost linearly correlated with the parameters of the vocal tract, which are in turn correlated in a stable way with the parameters of the body, as far as all the entire population of deers is concerned. And this provides evidence on the body size, pretty direct. Okay. Yeah. And if we have information donation, then this can have high information value. We can we can have a meaning space that provides information on many domains, and this is built on trust, right? And this is the key component, because any system, any language-like system, or any system, when you, not just language, but if you transfer semantic content, you need trust. It requires trust, because if you read a paper, you have no idea whether what's written in the paper is true or not, right? You have to kind of accept as face value that it is true, and later on you can check the facts and you can find that it is wrong. But as a default attitude, you have to trust the message. Whereas for displays, you have the evidence right there, right? So display is itself evidence of the quality of which it is about. Okay, so the argument that we developed, Przemek and I developed elsewhere, is that all the criterion for all, or the precondition for all language-like communication, for all massive large-scale information donation to non-relatives, is a platform of trust. Yes, so with this in mind, if we have behaviors or manifestations such as symbols, they can also function in those two types. So for example, if we have like the use of red ochre, which is argued to be symbolic, we can interpret that as symbolic and as symbols that are information donation, or symbols that are displays. Right, and I'm worried about inferences that go from symbols as displays to symbols as information donation, because to me, these are two completely separate things. Because symbols as displays, well, not just symbols, but things as displays, you can have kind of for free, whereas things or messages as information donation require a platform of trust. So this is time for taking stock in terms of interim conclusions before I progress to discussing pantomime specifically. So evolutionary explanations start from need to start from costs and benefits, and cognition follows, right? Cognition is the follower. Cognition adapts to what pays off to the animal, including the human animal. Displays versus information donation, they are two different types of communication under different conditions and with different design specifications, and you can't go from one to the other directly. And with this in mind, I would like to talk about pantomime. And how much time do I have left? About Is it about 10 minutes perhaps?
About 10 minutes, yes.
All right, so we have different types of pantomime, and the last two examples are movies that you've seen in the previous presentation, thanks to Przemek, so you're familiar with them. So you have, okay, you have a ritual, you have displays, you have pantomime in arts and general performance, you have pantomime as teaching and demonstration, and you have pantomime as kind of pre-linguistic communication, right? So many different manifestations. And there is a definition that Przemek already discussed. So this kind of unifies all of those examples of pantomime, but then there are different definitions that that are around. Let me say. So pantomimes are forms of actions that are either reduced or exaggerated, right? And some people say that pantomimes are reduced forms of actions. And some people say that pantomimes are exaggerated forms of action. And which is correct, would you say? Okay, I'm going to continue, but that was like inviting you to think a little bit on whether pantomime is reduced representations of actions or exaggerated, right? And my answer is it's kind of both, right? And if I move them in a different direction, then perhaps you can already start guessing what I'm driving at, right? That these are different types of pantomime with different functional specifications, and they have simply different properties following from that. Okay, so pantomimes as displays, pantomime as displays is dyadic, is performative, so it's about form rather than content. Energy is wasted rather than conserved. This is very, very important. This is a key dimension of efficiency that kind of was mentioned in Przemek's presentation as well. Movements are redundant and repeated. They are highly stereotyped. Span is maximized. Pantomimes tend to be multimodal, although modality is a little bit problematic. Motivation is direct in the sense of iconicity is there. Usually they are motivated by iconicity. And there are no norms, at least no norms are predicted to be there. It's also a bit complicated, this criterion. Whereas pantomime as information donation is triadic in terms of mimesis. So it involves the performer and it involves the spectator, so to say, and a third kind of entity. It's declarative rather than performative. It's about content, transmission of content rather than just form. Energy is conserved, very important. It is predicted to be non-redundant. It's not stereotyped. Span is minimized, which is related to conservation of energy. It is predicted to be monomodal. Motivation is degraded in the sense of iconicity gives way to conventionality, although these are not like opposites, but there is a trade-off between them. And norms, semiotic conventions appear, right? Key criterion, energy, wasted versus conserved. Because efficiency, that is conservation of energy, predicts a lot of properties of pantomime as information donation. Okay, and I have about 7 minutes to briefly discuss different types of pantomime in terms of the characteristics that I've just proposed. So first we have threat and courtship displays in different animals, and we know what they are, and we can analyze perhaps some examples of pantomime as displays. And they are dyadic, they are performative, wasting energy is essential to them. They are repeated and redundant, and they are stereotyped. They are about maximizing span, multimodal, motivated, and perhaps normative. That's so there are a lot of different examples, right? But when you think of prototypical examples, perhaps that would be the list. So that pantomime as displays is display, okay, not surprisingly. And then we have some examples of pantomime from theater, dance, and art. That is performance, and there are also different kinds of performance, and some kinds of pantomimic performance depend on the transmission of semantic content. So this is more problematic, but In terms of prototypical examples, there are analyses that kind of highlight the exaggeration element in pantomime, and athletic ability, and wasting the performance energy, right? So at the very least, dance is definitely dyadic, it's not triadic. It's performative. Although, okay, with all of that, you can think about counterexamples like telling story by dancing, but that would be a highly non-prototypical example. Energy is wasted, definitely. It's repeated and redundant. It is stereotyped, span is maximized. It's perhaps monomodal, like the activity of dancing, unless it's dancing and singing. Whether it's motivated, it's difficult to understand, and whether it's normative, perhaps there are some conventions in dance. Okay, when it comes to rituals, there are different types of rituals, but at least one view, not a theory, but like an approach to rituals, views rituals as costly signals. So rituals would have a lot of properties of displays, right? Formality, repetition, redundancy, stereotypy, and the more intense the ritual and repetitive, the more kind of effective it is, at least in the perception of spectators. So if you take the example of the haka dance, for example, it's dyadic. Whether it's dyadic, it's again problematic. It's probably performative, although we can think of, so okay, going back to the view of Henrich, creds, credibility enhancing displays, Henrich also kind of highlights the function of rituals to transmit semantic content, and Petter's view of ritual is that ritual is important in like transmitting semantic content in the view of like practices. So there would be exceptions, but at least the haka dance is definitely performative rather than declarative. Energy is wasted, definitely. Repeated, redundant, stereotype, maximized span, multimodal. Whether it's motivated or arbitrary, it's probably arbitrary and normative. So these two would not fit. And then we have final examples of teaching. And my favorite definition of teaching, which effectively says that teaching is a form of information donation. So it needs to have those game theoretic criteria kind of met before teaching emerges. So teaching does not only require that the teacher understands that the pupil doesn't know something, but the teacher must be motivated to teach, must be motivated to understand that that the pupil doesn't know something, right? The teacher needs to care in the first place. Okay, all right. So teaching is mixed, but in general, it's information donation, and it has some properties of displays, but just because but these are driven by effectiveness of teaching rather than efficiency. So there is a little bit of conflict here. Okay, and I have to go to conclusion in a couple of minutes. So I have time to discuss pre-language, and by pre-language, I specifically mean this point of transition in human communication, like actual human communication of actual human societies, when they start with a system of bodily communication, and it very quickly becomes a sign language. But just before it becomes sign language, it is something that would be described and classified as pantomime, and is described and classified as such by, in her pioneering research by Ana Mineiro. So we can see the pressures for efficiency at work, right? So we have trust, we have this platform of trust. So now we can work towards more and more efficient communication rather than, you can shed all of the elements of display. So I don't have the time to discuss the details, but in her research paper, Mineiro et al., she presents 4 phases of the development of a new sign language, like from scratch. And in the first phase, the first half year, participants had to use pantomime with their entire bodies, very, very energetically costly signals. So for example, airplane would be like moving around with your arms outstretched, and you don't stand still, you move in the space, right? Next half a year, it stays the same. Next half a year, you start using just your hand. And in the final half year, you just have a unimanual sign, right? You just use one arm instead of the entire body. It's the same story with a sign for goat. So first you move your entire body and then you just move your hand and arm. Precious for efficiency. Yes, so pre-language is definitely triadic, is definitely declarative. Energy is conserved. There is as little redundancy as possible. It's flexible, not stereotyped, in order to be able to express a range of meanings. Span is minimized, as you could see. It is multimodal, but for different reasons. It is definitely arbitrary and normative in the sense of conventional. So that would be an example. You've seen this video, so let me go to taking stock. And it would be this. So there is a table that summarizes the different types of pantomime in terms of the criteria, and it shows you a gradation from display to pre-language. And here is a plan of the emergence, evolutionary emergence of pantomime and language that is offered by Peter in one of his papers. And as an alternative, maybe not as an alternative, but as a complement, perhaps, I would like to offer this rival approach where we approach things not from like the point of view of cognitive complexity, but rather from the point of view of disalignment and alignment of interest, right? And this would lead to this classification. We have mimesis, which is at least more or less volitional control of your body in a weak sense of mimesis. And we can have disalignment of interest, which predicts displays. And the more alignment we have more advanced types of mimesis that some of them rely on the platform of trust. And then you can see that performance, for example, is not a unitary category. We have like two phases of performance and we have two phases of rituals. So perhaps there are very, very different rituals that we use the same word to describe them, but they are different phenomena at the core. Right, so I think it's the very last one. Display and pre-language are pantomimic extremes on the alignment of interest continuum. Teaching is teaching is problematic for several reasons. Ritual is not a coherent category, and the same goes for performance. Pantomimic theories assume that pantomime will conventionalize and simplify. It will not unless we have a platform of trust. That would be the conclusion, and the approach to use as complement is not just cognitive complexity, but costs and benefits and payoffs. And I have had this to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Slavik. You were in the red a lot with your internet, but it went very smooth. We didn't have any hiccups in the sound because of it. Thank you very much. Questions?
Thank you.
Peter and Adam. Let's start with Adam, please.
Yes, hi. So I'm not a specialist in this, so maybe this is a question from ignorance, but I was kind of surprised that none of the three talks mentioned sign languages. Shouldn't, according to your hypothesis, shouldn't we all be speaking sign languages? I mean, they are much less iconic than, you know, prototypical pantomime, but they seem to be much more iconic than, you know, the normal kind of phonetic languages, right? So shouldn't that be, you know, the natural step of the evolution? Thanks.
So I will try to start. Thank you for the question. It's of course it's a good question, and perhaps Przemek will help me along the way. But let me start to offer an explanation. We actually are working on. So this is a well-known problem. If we start bodily, why do we have like spoken languages, which are the default, right? So this modality transition problem. But there are many good and not so good explanations to that. But one would be that it's still precious for efficiency. So once we have, so if we accept this platform of trust, it has many kind of consequences down the line, because with the platform of trust, all of the pressures for displays are removed, and you can have pressures for efficiency. And pressures for efficiency working on a bodily language that is energetically more expensive will eventually lead to its transition to a spoken language, which is energetically less costly. And there are problems for that as well, because we gesticulate when we speak. But that would be what we want to, that would be the line of argument that we would like to develop in the near future. I wonder what Przemek has more to say about that.
Sorry, but is it established that sign languages are less efficient than spoken languages?
Energetically costly, it would be. I don't know of any such studies. We were thinking of doing such studies, but apparently they are difficult to do, because effectively what you would need to do is you would need to measure energy expenditure. It's not that simple, but like common sense would perhaps suggest that, you know, using your hands to talk is more costly than just using spoken language.
There's a question also from Peter. Peter, please.
Thank you very much, Slavik, for bringing in the ecology. I mean, the pace check is very much a question of what determines the value of communication. And I also, of course, like your distinction between the red and the blue stuff here. Let me give you an anecdote. Many years ago, I met Richard Byrne at the conference, and he gave a talk about the life of gorillas, and he spent a lot of time with gorillas. And after his talk, I asked him, if you could communicate with gorillas via sign language and so on, would you like to communicate with them? And he said, no, they're only interested in sex and violence. So he wouldn't think that's interesting. And that means that their life is very much about disalignment. While we humans or hominins have been much more dependent on alignment, the ecology of the hominins was dependent on cooperation for food, and also cooperation to defend against enemies. But in chimpanzees, you don't need to cooperate to obtain food. You find some cooperation when it comes to enemies. I mean, chimps go on border patrols. A group of males and sometimes females go on and look for the neighboring group, and sometimes are very aggressive. And somehow they have to coordinate this border patrol system. But anyway, I mean, your division here is very interesting, and I think there is a lot of merit to it. So more work needs to be done on when cooperation is needed and when we can do without cooperation. This was not a question; it was just a comment.
Thank you very much. Maybe a quick comment that yes, there are some approaches, like I know better than that you discuss ecology and pressures for cooperation, like expressly and explicitly in your papers, and Tomasello does as well. So I need to acknowledge that as well. Okay. Thank you.
JT is also raising his hand. JT.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to all three speakers for the excellent talks. Slawomir, I wanted to make a comment and then ask a question to all three, if I can. The comment is, in your talk of the evolution of pantomime, it reminds me very much of Arthur Koestler in The Act of Creation, talks about acting styles in cinema and how you can go back 20 years in chunks and see how the acting styles in film, for example, or screen media has become, it used to be much more explicit, obviously, or exaggerated in silent films because there is no audio channel for language. There is text, of course, intertitle screens. But as you look across the evolution of acting styles from Charlie Chaplin through to, say, Marlon Brando, or these days, I forget the actor's name, but he was in Drive. It's a very minimalistic acting style, so that there is almost no explicit body language, pantomime, gesturing. It is very, they're like a rock, and they may move their hands a tiny bit, but not the rest of their body. The evolution of pantomime to language seems to reflect some sort of similar transition in evolution of screen media over time. I just thought that was an interesting evolutionary parallel, perhaps. The question I have for all three, I think all three speakers mentioned mimesis. I've just been reading in the cultural evolution research where they distinguish between, with primates teaching, imitation, where you copy the process. So if a chimp teaches a baby chimp how to pick up a rock and crack a nut, there is imitation, which is copying the exact process, or emulation, which means just copying the product. So it doesn't matter if I copy your movements exactly with imitation or mimesis. It's more, as long as the end product is the same, as long as I use the rock somehow to crack the nut, even if it's not a copy or an imitation of your teaching movement. What are the opinions of the panel on this distinction between imitation, emulation? Is that an important distinction for you all, or?
So let me start, but I'll be very brief. So as far as I know, it's a problematic distinction, and there is some new research on that. But from my perspective, specifically from my theoretical perspective, a chimpanzee or a generalized ape does what makes sense, right? So imitation, and especially human style over imitation, doesn't make any sense to an ape, right? So why do it? That would be my answer.
I agree that this is a fairly somewhat problematic distinction, but still, the reason, I mean, Whiten and others have shown that children prefer to imitate and chimps prefer to emulate. But this is not completely true. They've shown it that they're even chimps sometimes imitate. But the important thing is when you need to imitate when the sequence of action is more complicated. In order to achieve a goal. I mean, to crack a nut, you only have to, there is one movement, and you can do it in many ways, and you can still achieve the result. But if you are napping a stone axe, there is a large sequence of actions, and unless you get the actions in the right order, you don't achieve the result. So for me, the distinction is more connected to the complexity of the procedure that is needed to achieve the goal.
Przemek, would you also like to respond the final word?
There is a recent paper by Cecilia Hayes about different types of imitation and different types of emulation. So and she takes a very broad view of things, so to speak. So I would rather refer to her paper. Yes, so I suggest if you're interested in imitation and emulation, then this is a good read.
Thank you. Great. I will look for that Cecilia Hayes paper. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Okay, so here we come at the end. So thank you very much, Slawomir, for your presentation as well. We're going to go to the breakout room soon, but first I want to say thanks again to all three speakers, to Peter, Przemek, and Slavek, for their very interesting talks. I also want to thank Kles, so both Przemek and Slawomir again for co-hosting this webinar. And then I want to say that we are not having a webinar in August. We're taking a summer break, and we're going to be back in September, where we are going to be celebrating the publication of the Oxford University book that we have been editing, Christina and Andy Locke and I, for many years for the Oxford University Press on human symbolic evolution. And so we're going to have several speakers of that book, and it's a bit cheating because all three speakers today were also already part of that handbook. But so in September, we're going to have more speakers, and we're going to have April Noel and Augusta Gaspar. and Natalie Umini, and that's going to be in September. And also in September is going to be the next Protolang conference. So if you have not registered yet, I think that is still possible to do so. And that is going to be organized this year by Stefan Hartmann and help me out here. What's his name? The guy from Düsseldorf.
Stefan Hartmann is the guy from Düsseldorf.
Yes, but the other one.
But Michel Playa, Michael
Also,
has been involved,
yes.
Vitally involved.
And the philosopher, very smart guy. What's his name?
Matt, probably. No, sorry.
You mean Karim?
Yes, that's it, Karim. Karim Bahavit or something like that. Very smart guy in philosophy. So
yeah,
that is the one. That is the one. So please join us there then as well. Okay, so
and registration is free. So due to generous funding from the university and the German Research Foundation, it's an online conference, and registration is free. So do register and take part in the conference, and I posted a link to the website so you can have a look at the program and our plenary speakers. It's from September 6th to September 8th online.
Thank you very much, Michael. Okay, so on that note, thank you very much, everybody, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.